Nah, it's not happening.
One kind gesture, and neighbors can become the best of friends.
How's it going?
Hey.
Hey.
My cousin's stuck here.
Tell you what, I got some chains. We'll pull them out, okay?
Hey, thank you, Walter.
He thought he was a neat guy.
The best neighbor we've ever had.
One argument, and they can turn into the worst of enemies.
I told you I need this to get to my property. This is my driveway, Bob.
He thought that he made himself clear, but
Get out of the way!
obviously not.
Once conflict starts, a happy home becomes a living hell.
Show yourself!
He was hearing noises at night, and he didn't know what it was.
I'm gonna drive that boy crazy.
And in hell, someone always gets burned.
If this could happen, it's just beyond comprehension.
No!
I think it was straight up murder.
In the Santa Cruz foothills of California lies a beautiful retreat known as Lompico.
Lompico is very serene and beautiful. It's a perfect place to be if you want to be kind of in the nature and still be able to commute.
Geographically, it's almost extraordinary, but it's quite remote.
Bachelor Bob Hall has had a house here for several years.
Bob moved to Lompico because it was quiet and serene, and to get away from the hustle and bustle. Bob liked to live in a natural state where he was surrounded by forests.
Bob's cousins, Joan and Stephen, loved their visits to his hillside retreat.
Are you kidding me? You won again.
Bob's a good sport.
Yeah, good sport.
He treated my wife and myself and my children like we were his brother and sister and not more distant relatives. We were always welcome in his house.
Bob was a quiet gentleman, very soft-spoken, and he liked to laugh.
For the most part, Bob keeps to himself, so he doesn't notice when Walter Stevens moves into the nearest house down the road.
Walt was in his mid-20s. He had just gotten out of the Coast Guard and was very excited about living up there. It was his first place. Walt worked for a machinist in San Jose. He loved to fix things. He loved to do things for people.
Walter quickly endears himself to other neighbors, Leo Weber, Dan Wilson, and Stella.
Walter was a very calm, easygoing, happy-go-lucky, friendly fellow. Enthusiastic about life.
He was really like a mama's good boy in a certain way. He didn't smoke pot. He didn't drink beers when I'd offer him a beer.
I was predisposed to like him because being ex-Navy myself and he being ex-Coast Guard, we had something in common there.
This comes as no surprise to Walter's longtime friend, Sue Frederick.
Hey, workhorse, come eat.
They all loved Walt. He was just a really nice guy. Kind of like you would say a Boy Scout.
When Bob and Walter finally meet, his Boy Scout nature comes to the fore.
Nah, it's not happening. God, you're in there pretty good.
How's it going?
Hey.
Hey.
My cousin's stuck here.
Bob, right?
Yeah.
I'm Walter Stevens.
Oh, Walt, yeah.
Yeah, Walter Stevens. I just moved into Moreland's place.
Oh, well, nice to meet you.
Tell you what, I got some chains. We'll pull them out, okay? I'll be back in a couple minutes. Right?
Seriously?
Yeah.
Thank you, Walter.
No problem.
Walter came along and hooked up the chain and pulled his car out. And Bob thought he was a neat guy for doing that.
Our rural setting seems the perfect place for their friendship to blossom. That's not going to happen.
Bob! No!
After settling in, Walter throws himself into community work, like fixing Lompico's main road.
He was very helpful. We do all the maintenance on the road ourselves, and he worked with us all the time. And even though his property barely was on the road.
Oh, hey, Leo, how's it going? I'll be down in 5.
He put more energy than other people, enough so that a lot of us called him the best neighbor we've ever had.
The first sign of trouble in paradise comes when Walter sees Bob rumbling up his driveway.
Bob Hall wanted to access land that he had purchased by using the driveway.
These particular pieces of land are quite inaccessible. It's very rugged. Bob couldn't access the property through his own driveway, so he decided Walt's would be his access. Bob wanted to, in effect, use that as his own road.
It's an invasion of privacy, really.
In order to get to his upper property, Bob needed to cross over a fairly wide drainage ditch. So Bob put in a culvert, which is like a big pipe. And he would use this culvert as if it were a bridge.
Bob's been hard at work with some big plans.
Welcome to my new home. Yeah, jacuzzi, second story. We'll have like a pool table, the works. All this is mine. I've worked hard.
Happy for you.
This is my dream.
Bob wanted to build a house that he could live in so that he could rent his other house out for income.
The home was going to be larger than the one that he occupied currently, and that the view was better. You were up higher up on the hill. He could look out at the forest, and it was a little more secluded because it wasn't on the road like his other house was.
Hey, Bob.
Hey, Walt.
What are we doing on my driveway?
Oh, no. That's not your driveway. It's a road called Lilac Lane.
When we heard that Bob was using Walt's driveway and calling it Lilac Lane, we thought it was funny. It was absurd.
Lilac Lane.
Yeah.
Bob believes that so-called Lilac Lane is a public road, and he has every right to use it.
I'm pretty sure that's my driveway.
No, trust me. I've done all the research on it.
What are you talking about?
My property is way too steep down here, so I got to come all the way around, and this is where I store my gear.
Nobody in the community knew that driveway as Lilac Lane. It was to his benefit to think of it as a road, even though it was Walt's driveway and went right next to his house.
I think part of the issue may have been the original records and the way that was all carried out, where the actual property markers were.
Did you put in that culvert too?
The culvert,
Right.
yeah, trust me. You're going to thank me when spring comes, the flood and all that. That thing is high quality, believe me.
Okay.
I'll get you the permits, or you can check it out. It'll all be good. Take care, Walt.
Sure.
We didn't think a whole lot of it, and something that these guys are going to have to work out.
Unconvinced, Walter investigates Bob's claim.
Where is the line, actually? And where is Lilac Lane, and who owns what part of this dead-end dirt road? And Walt hired a surveyor, and he got results.
So I am right.
The driveway in question is and was the driveway for Walt's house.
Walter believes he's entirely justified in what he does next.
Walt went up and ripped out the culvert so that it couldn't be used as a road anymore. And of course that destroyed Bob's plans of being able to get up to the top of the property.
Whoa! What are you doing?
As well as wasted the money that he spent on the culvert and the time and the effort to put the culvert in.
I told you I need this to get to my property.
Bob, this is my property. You cannot put this culvert in here. This is my driveway, Bob.
Any unselfish person would be happy to share the road, but he just didn't want to share.
In a quiet neighborhood in the hills, the door to chaos is now wide open.
I didn't think the edge of the cliff was this close, and they've gone off.
That kind of behavior is usually associated with someone that's a sociopath.
This is not a driveway, this is a street. Move your car. Move the car. Move the car.
I told
This is my property. You cannot put this culvert in here.
Neighbor disputes tend to be volatile, unpredictable, and sometimes highly charged emotionally. You never know what you're going to expect.
Walter Stevens has just ripped out a drainage culvert installed by his neighbor, Bob Hall.
Having his property damaged was very frustrating to Bob, and I think it was a vindictive thing that Walter was doing.
I think if you spend the money, you could change the drainage a bit and get two driveways side by side or some semblance of respecting Walt's house. But nobody really went that direction, I guess.
According to Bob, the driveway is really a public road called Lilac Lane.
Bob wanted to use Lilac Lane because he was building another home up the hill, and there was no way to get to it.
Welcome to my new home.
Bob sought help with getting surveyors out there to find out what was up, what was right.
That surveyor produced records that told Bob Hall that he was entitled to use that portion of that road.
After that, Bob decided to redo the culvert. It was taken out by Walter, and it was very costly to Bob, financially.
It was very disturbing that Bob would do it when Walt wasn't home. And Walt would come home to find that. I think Walter thought that he made himself clear, but obviously not.
The message that Bob isn't welcome on Walter's driveway is soon driven home hard.
Bob's shed was knocked down and vandalized. He had a pretty good idea who did it, although it could never be proved.
It seems reasonable because of the dispute to think that Walter Stevens had a hand in that.
It had to have been Walter.
Even if Bob isn't sure about Walter's involvement in this incident, the next one leaves no doubt.
Walt put a barricade across the road. It seemed pretty unreasonable that he was denying access for everybody to use the road.
I mean, these are just juveniles, the way they're dealing with this issue.
Concerned for both men, neighbor Leo attempts to intervene.
You got a sec?
Yeah. What's up, Leo?
Bob, you know Lilac Lane isn't a road.
And he said, Walt will want to give it to me, I'll win.
What are you talking about?
Bob actually told me, pressured him until he lets me use it.
I'm going to work him so hard that I drive him crazy, and I'll get it.
The fire department had Walter remove the barricade because it was stakes put in the ground, cemented into the ground with a heavy chain across from stake to stake. And that would have made it very difficult for any fire trucks to get through and put out a fire if they needed to.
Bob is back in business, but for the moment, Walter has his attentions elsewhere.
Welcome to your new home.
All right, put your bags up on the table. Okay.
I hear if you help your mom.
When I moved in with Walt, he was doing me a huge favor by letting me rent there. I needed a place pretty much immediately as I was separating from my ex-husband.
Just up the stairs on the right is your bed, okay? And there's some fresh towels for you.
If we're sleeping up there, where are you sleeping?
He gave up his bedroom for my children and I.
Oh, you're paying rent. You're helping me so much. I'm just gonna sleep on the couch.
Me, Tyler, and Luke took the bedroom, and Walt Stevens slept on the couch, actually.
Walt he's the kind of guy that would lay his cloak down over the puddle for a woman. He was a very caring individual, and he took a lot of responsibility for Sue and the kids.
Yeah, no worries. Can I get you anything? A coffee, tea?
I definitely think Walt Stevens had a crush on me. I wasn't attracted to him, and we became really good friends.
It doesn't take long for Sue to be dragged into Walter's feud.
Walt was gone on a camping trip, so he wasn't even there. And bam, 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 bam. I opened the door to somebody I've never, ever seen before screaming at me.
Move your car! You need to move your car now!
Screaming about a car.
Wait, move your car! Listen!
I don't know anything about.
Move your car!
He freaked me out. I was scared.
Move it!
She was quite frightened by his behavior. She did call the police. Bob was demanding the car be moved because it was in the way.
They always park right here. They stop me from getting by. This isn't a driveway. This is a road. This is my truck. I can't get by.
Sure, that's not for you to decide.
It was very upsetting to Sue. She had no idea that she was walking into this hornet's nest.
That's not okay. He can't do that. Like,
It's fine.
I think Walt felt an obligation to protect me and my children.
You know, he's just an old guy.
he's crazy. I don't trust what he's doing at all. Like,
He really felt that pressure, and he wanted to make sure we were going to be okay.
I'm gonna go talk to him tomorrow.
I'm sure it's not going to happen again. Just
I
leave
don't
it.
know. I don't trust him.
Time goes on, and the intimidation continues.
I'm there in the middle of the woods, just kind of walking around. All of a sudden...
What do you want?
Oh, this is all bringing back a weird memory. Ugh. I don't know what kind of person he was. All I know is how he made me feel. Scared.
Sue fears Bob's ominous behavior will never let up.
I was in the kitchen. I saw Bob staring at me through the window. He was giving me this cold, blank stare. Freaked me out. Why is some guy staring at me? Why is he standing there? Shut the door and locked it. Locked all the doors. He scared me so much. I just got a bad vibe from him.
Soon enough, Walter himself becomes the target of strange occurrences.
It says sometimes I get these calls in the middle of the night, and be like 2 in a row, and they just hang up.
Hello?
If you're getting phone calls in the middle of the night,
Again.
is that just a joke or a mistake, or is that Bob?
Wonder who that could be.
Then your power goes off, but you never got your bill.
No, you didn't send me an email. I didn't get it. You have my new address, right? No, there shouldn't be a balance. I paid my last bill. I'm looking at it right now. How could this have happened?
Bob?
Walter and Sue both suspect Bob is behind it all.
Walt was concerned about, what's Bob going to do? Where's this going?
I definitely think that Bob was trying to drive Walt crazy.
And one day, Bob is caught red-handed.
Bob was stealing his mail. Sue had actually seen him do it.
Walt, I want my mail back.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, yeah?
What makes you think I took your mail?
Just stop.
That would be so frustrating if you were a neighbor, and it's just a complete invasion of one's expectations of how you behave.
This is a felony, I mean, on a federal level. We thought he was a sociopath.
I think that Bob thought was just to cause aggravation, getting back in a nonviolent way to Walter. So he took some mail, and it was wrong, and he knew it.
But nothing prepares Walter for what disappears next.
One day he came home and he found his little car had been towed out of his driveway.
No!
And it had been dropped off a couple of miles down the road, and it had been left unlocked, and everything inside had been stolen.
Walter is convinced Bob is responsible.
When Bob had Walter's car towed from Walter's driveway, I mean, that was a violation. That was like a crime against you.
I think Bob had a mission to destroy Walter. He seemed like he would stop at nothing to ruin Walt's life.
Bob! You're not gonna get away with this! Get your ass over here now!
When a reasonable person thinks about what these two men were doing, it's just ridiculous. They were both behaving inappropriately. Neither one used any common sense.
The dispute between Bob Hall and Walter Stevens has escalated from stealing mail to grand theft auto.
If somebody towed my car down the street with my tools in it and my tools got stolen, I'd be very irate. And I would want to prosecute, persecute, or come after the person that did that.
You know why he's doing this?
I told him that Bob is doing these things to push your buttons.
Well, it's working.
Walter broke down, crying, and it was a sad thing to see. And it became this, how much does somebody work on you until you give in? Or you erupt?
Bob also moves to put the drainage culvert issue to rest, once and for all.
When Walt was gone, Bob brought in a culvert and he cemented it in.
You hear me? Come out here now! I know you're in there, Bob!
Bob!
You coward!
You hear me?
This time, Walter meets fire with fire.
Walt was driving the backhoe up the driveway. As I was making some lunch, looking out the window at him, all of a sudden, Bob came running through the trees out of his property.
Bob, what are you doing?
You can't do this!
Get out of the way!
No! He can't! No!
Get out of here, Bob!
He actually stood in front of the backhoe to stop Walter Stevens from digging anything up.
Hoping that if he was to stand his ground, the digging of his culvert would cease because he was standing in the way.
Get out of the way!
No! Back
Move!
up,
You
Bob!
put this on my property,
No!
Bob!
No!
Move!
Back
I
up!
do not want to hurt you, Bob!
Back
Get out of the
up!
way!
A possessed Bob Hall is determined to protect the route to where his dream home will one day stand.
Look out!
As Walt was going to put the backhoe onto the cement, Bob laid his body on the cement to protect it. I was dumbfounded. I could not believe somebody would do that.
Bob, move!
This backhoe is going from left to right, and Bob is going right around with it, trying to protect his piece of cement. It was like this cat and mouse dance. My kids were freaked out because they'd never seen anything like that before.
Bob, no! No!
Why was he laying his body on the cement?
Walt, what are you doing?
Sue, get the video camera!
Don't move, okay? Stay right here.
He said, tape this. And I was like, okay.
By the time Sue returns, Bob is sprawled on the cement in agony.
What is going on?
Ugly way! No! Walt, you can't do this!
Bob said Walter took the bucket and lifted Bob off the ground 5 or 6 feet and tipped the bucket, and Bob fell out, landed on the back of his head and his neck and his shoulders.
Walter tells a different story.
When Walt had the backhoe end up in the air, Bob grabbed onto it, and then he, was just hanging onto it, keeping Walter from moving the backhoe head around. And then Walt vibrated it, flicked the handle a bit, and Bob said that he had fell down and attacked the backhoe.
This was serious. This was something that I'd never seen before. I called the police.
He pitchforked you? Yes, with the backhoe. He picks the bucket up and he's getting ready to crush it. He tried to pitchfork me with it.
Walter Stevens gave one version of the story. Bob Hall gave another.
He just showed up there. And he got in the way. He just threw himself in front of me.
Unfortunately, the police, presented with 2 different stories, were not able to determine what happened.
Go see a doctor about that neck there, okay?
Thank you, officer.
Okay, no problem.
There just wasn't enough information and evidence to prove or disprove whose version of the story was accurate.
Well, until we get everything resolved, leave that culvert in place, okay?
But this is my property that he put that there. Why do I have to suffer through this?
The backhoe incident showed that Walter was absolutely not going to put up with what Bob was doing, and Bob showed that he would go to any lengths to continue this process that they were in. He would risk his own safety.
Bob went to the ER, and he called me, asked if I would come and pick him up, which I did. I pleaded with him all the way back to Lompico to please don't go home. And he said, no, I'll be fine.
Bob, I'm really worried about you.
We suggested that Bob move away from there because of all the aggravation that he was living through.
I can't leave, Joe. I love it here.
We'll maybe give it some more time.
Bob is resolute. He will finish building his dream home in the woods, no matter what the cost.
We were concerned about his safety. His friends at work were concerned. Family members clear back to South Carolina were concerned. And yet, Bob was a man that felt like he could take care of himself.
Someone will be taken care of, all right.
This has gotten pretty extreme. How much farther can it go?
Why didn't they move, either one of them? I think they were both very stubborn, and they both thought they were right.
Since police can't determine who's in the wrong, Walter Stevens and Bob Hall must settle their feud themselves.
Bob had some guns in his home, one of which was a pistol next to his bed. He probably felt that this was some protection for himself, because if Walter was going to do crazy things, like scare him to death with a backhoe, he could take care of himself.
Walter also buys a gun, causing friend and tenant Sue Frederick to say enough is enough.
Walt? I didn't want to even really be up at that property. I didn't want to be a part of what was going on, and I didn't want to deal with it.
I think I have to leave.
Why?
It wasn't my fight to fight. I didn't want to be involved in it.
I'm scared, Walt.
For Walter, things only get worse.
Bob served him with a lawsuit claiming that he injured him.
Mentioned in this paperwork was the vandalism to his property and, of course, bodily injury. And those are just a few of the things that were listed.
This was all weighing on Walt financially. He was going to lose me as a tenant. He was paying for a surveyor. He was going to have to pay a lawyer. There were so many things.
Bob had a real problem. For some reason, He hated Walter and was determined to destroy him at any cost. That was clear to me. He would stop at nothing.
Bob seemed absolutely, he's going to get what he wants the way he wants.
I'm gonna drive that boy crazy.
Bob's behavior continues to push Walter closer to the edge.
Walter was hearing noises at night, and he didn't know what it was.
Get off my property! Now!
And he thought that Bob could be, you know, coming around his house at night.
Show yourself!
Walt was definitely a little jumpy, and he was definitely getting paranoid.
The deterioration of Walt's emotional state, that was what I observed. I saw him get more and more stressed.
I'm gonna drive that boy crazy.
More and more anxious.
I'm gonna drive that boy crazy.
More and more angry.
Drive that boy crazy.
Finally, one cold California morning in 1998, the conflict reaches its climax.
On Friday morning, November 20th, it was still dark outside, and Walter came outside. He heard a noise. He went back into the house and picked up his pistol. And he said, "Who goes there?"
Show yourself!
And there was no answer. He saw a figure walking towards him, and then he saw a flash of light.
That day also happens to be a special one in Bob's career.
It was going to be his last day. They were actually planning a party for him, a going-away party. He was very popular where he worked.
But Bob is late for his own retirement party.
He never showed up for work. The people at his work had the sense to call the sheriff's department to go out and do a home security check.
Deputy Sheriff Stephen Watson and his partner Deputy Dillard are sent to investigate.
It was very unusual from what we were hearing for him not to have arrived at his work function and not have notified anybody that he was going to be late or not able to attend at all.
Mr. Hall?
So our level of concern has certainly become elevated.
Anybody home?
The other deputy noticed that there had been a fire in the fireplace and the home was still warm, but everything appeared to be in order. He saw no evidence that would cause concern. He looked through his personal things and found a phone book. That deputy began to call Mr. Hall's relatives.
I decided to check the surrounding area to see if Mr. Hall may have wandered off and perhaps fallen and injured himself or become ill or somehow otherwise incapacitated. It was at that time I heard a male's voice.
Hey!
From a neighboring residence.
Walter Stevens appeared to be kind of bounding down his driveway towards the deputy.
The first thing out of his mouth was he wanted to know if I was here about his fire.
Are you guys here about my fire?
I'm burning some paint cans. I saw you drive by quickly.
I saw you pull up.
I explained to Mr. Stevens that I wasn't here about his fire.
Actually, we're here about your neighbor, Mr. Hall.
Oh, can't say I like the guy.
Walter Stevens kept bringing up the fire on the back of his property.
Anyway, I thought you guys were here because of my fire.
Nope, just looking for your neighbor.
And I thought that was unusual. A normal person would be concerned about his neighbor as well, I would presume. But Mr. Stevens was more concerned about the fire.
Hi, Sheriff Dillard, Santa Cruz County. Sheriff.
Meanwhile, Watson's partner has reached Bob's sister-in-law.
Yeah, we're trying to locate Bob Hall. I'm actually calling from inside his house. It appears he's gone missing.
Know where we can find him?
Nope, haven't seen him.
She immediately exclaimed that it was Walter Stevens. It must have done something to Bob, that he's responsible for Bob being missing.
Okay, Walt Stevens. Well, yes, his neighbor. Mr. Stevens? Yeah.
Deputy Dillard began speaking with Mr. Stevens about Bob Hall. Meanwhile, I excused myself, said that I wanted to look at the fire that Walter Stevens had made me so curious about. beside the burning pile, there was some lumber, including 2x4s and 2x6s, which I thought was odd because the lumber looked like it was usable. And there was also, even more strangely, a couch on top of the fire. And I was struck by the odor. The fire smelled very strongly, something that seemed like it should be familiar to me. It wasn't consciously certain what I was smelling, but something was wrong, and it wasn't just paint cans. And then I noticed something underneath the couch.
Move this couch out of the way. You can try.
I asked him to get a piece of lumber that was laying nearby and to move the couch with a piece of lumber. It looked like he put almost no effort into it.
It's not gonna budge.
And only half-heartedly tried to move the couch and just moved it a little bit.
Put it down. Put it down.
And then I saw something that at first I thought was maybe the leg of a piece of furniture, like a chair. But when I took a closer look, I was shocked to find a human arm. And I realized that I knew where Bob Hall was. I had not consciously expected to find a body under that fire. That was my first murder investigation, and it's an event I'll never forget.
With our neighbor Bob Hall reported missing, police have made a gruesome discovery in Walter Stevens' fire pit.
I pulled my service weapon and I pointed it at Walter Stevens and I said,
"Sir, I apologize if that's not what I think it is."
"Then let me see your hands." Walter Stevens immediately put his hands up. He said, "Before you go any further, it is what you think it is."
Why did Walter choose to burn the body? Why? I wish I knew.
I can't think about him doing that, and it seems unbelievable to me. You know, this years later, 17 or so years later, it's unbelievable.
Walter admits to killing Bob and is arrested.
The cop told me that one neighbor had killed another neighbor, and I instantly thought that Bob had killed Walter.
The assumption we both made was that Bob had killed Walt, just because of the nature of their relationship.
I was very surprised when I found out that it was Bob that was dead.
We all were just absolutely devastated that this could happen. It's just beyond comprehension.
Facing a possible death sentence, Walter pleads self-defense.
He said it all happened real quickly, and he used the word blur, you know. It was still dark outside. He heard a noise, and he said, "Show yourself!" And there was no answer. And then the figure started walking towards him.
And the fact that he was holding this shiny silver object made Walter fear that he had a gun.
It turned out to be a big stainless steel thermos. And he said Bob started hitting him with the thermos. They fought for a little bit, and then Walter bent down and picked up a rock, and he hit Bob over the head. That was it. He was dead.
Bob!
My belief is that Walt went into shock. He didn't know what to do. And then he decided to get rid of the body the way he did.
I don't think that he was in his right mind. Who would do that?
If you act in self-defense, you haven't done anything wrong because you acted to prevent injury to yourself.
He appeared to be accepting of his fate, which we assumed would be a few years in prison.
But as the investigation continues, Walter's defense crumbles.
In the muzzle of the gun, the forensic experts found tissue and blood that were Bob Hall's, but also some dirt, some earth from the ground. And that tells us compellingly that Bob Hall was down on the ground when Walter Stevens was beating him. Walter Stevens viciously beat Bob Hall with the gun over and over again. After beating him viciously, Walter Stevens then shot Bob Hall. So the man's helpless and down on the ground, and then Walter Stevens shot him. There can be no claim that that was in self-defense.
I think it was straight up murder, and, you know, he deserves consequences for that.
He started the confrontation. He started it with the intent of killing him.
I believe that Walter Stevens may have got away with it if we hadn't found Bob when we did, before his body was completely destroyed by that fire.
His bones were actually burned and disintegrated. So all we had left was part of one arm and a little bit of a torso and some of his head. He was not recognizable as a body. Walter Stevens was sentenced to 40 years to life as a result of this crime. 15 years for the murder, plus 25 years for the use of the weapon.
To me, that seems in excess. I do think that Walt was pushed over the edge, and he snapped.
I know that some of my family members were happy that he got second degree. I personally think it should have been first-degree murder and all that went with that.
Bob Hall may have started their feud.
There are places where silence feels natural, where the wind moves through open land, where the distance from the city dulls the noise of human life. And then there are places where silence feels wrong. Heavy. Like something has been buried beneath it. On the outskirts of Vancouver, past the thinning neighborhoods and fading streetlights, there was a stretch of land that most people passed without a second thought. A farm. Mud, wire fences, rusted equipment, and the low, restless movement of pigs shifting through dirt. It didn't look like much. It wasn't meant to. Nothing about it asked questions. Nothing about it demanded attention. But if you had stood there long enough, if you had listened past the wind, past the distant hum of the highway, you might have felt it. Not heard it. Not seen it. Felt it. Something deeply out of place, buried beneath years of routine and decay. Because for nearly a decade, people went there and never came back. They weren't tourists. They weren't families or curious wanderers. They were women. Women who lived on the margins of the city, in a place called downtown East Side, a neighborhood known not for opportunity, but for survival. Some of them were struggling with addiction. Some traded their bodies to get through the night. Some were trying to disappear from their pasts. And some were simply trying to make it to the next day. They vanished quietly. No headlines. No urgency. No sirens cutting through the night in search of them. Just absence. At first, it was easy to ignore. In a place where life was already unstable, where people drifted in and out, a missing person didn't always register as something permanent. Maybe they moved. Maybe they found a way out. Maybe they didn't want to be found. But then it kept happening. One woman. Then another. Then another. Names began to pile up, not in newspapers, but in whispered conversations. Among friends who hadn't heard from someone in weeks. Among outreach workers who kept lists in notebooks. Among families who called police stations, over and over, hoping someone would listen. And still, the silence held. Somewhere beyond the city limits, a man continued his life as if nothing was wrong. He woke up in the mornings, walked across his property, fed his animals. He spoke to neighbors. He hosted gatherings. People came and went. Music sometimes drifted across the fields. Laughter, even. He didn't look like a monster. That's the thing about monsters. They rarely do. Robert Picton was, by all outward appearances, forgettable. A pig farmer. A man who lived alone. A man who blended into the rural edges of society so seamlessly that no one thought to look twice. His clothes were often dirty, his demeanor awkward but unremarkable. If anything, he seemed like someone life had passed by. But there are details that only make sense in hindsight. The way certain visitors were never seen again after arriving at his farm. The way rumors seemed to cling to the property, never fully forming into accusations. The way people who spoke too loudly about what they suspected often found themselves dismissed, ignored, or simply unheard. Time stretched on. Years. The number of missing women grew, slowly but steadily, like a crack widening beneath the surface. Still, no one connected the pattern in a way that forced action. Not officially. Not decisively. And then, in 2002, everything changed, not because someone finally solved the mystery, but because of something almost accidental. A search warrant. It wasn't even for murder. Authorities arrived at the farm looking for something else entirely. Weapons. Illegal firearms. A routine investigation, the kind that happens every day, the kind that rarely uncovers anything beyond what it was meant to find. But when they stepped onto that land, when they began to dig beneath the surface, literally and figuratively, they found something that didn't belong to any ordinary crime. At first, it was small. Fragments. Things that could be dismissed if you didn't look too closely. But investigators are trained to look closely. To notice what others might ignore. And what they began to uncover didn't fit any simple explanation. The soil itself seemed to hold secrets. Objects appeared where they shouldn't be. Personal belongings that didn't match the life of a pig farmer. Biological evidence that raised questions no one had prepared to answer. And then came the realization. Slow. Reluctant. Unavoidable. This wasn't just a farm. It was a crime scene. Not one crime. Not two. But something far larger. Something that stretched back years, hidden in plain sight while the world looked the other way. As forensic teams expanded their search, the scale of what they were dealing with began to emerge. DNA evidence. Multiple identities. A growing list that started to overlap with the names of women who had been reported missing, women whose cases had gone cold, whose lives had been reduced to files gathering dust. Suddenly, the silence broke. Media descended on the story. The public demanded answers. How could something like this happen, so close to a major city, for so long, without anyone stopping it? But the answers were complicated. And uncomfortable. Because this wasn't just the story of a man who killed. It was the story of who he chose. It was the story of who was ignored. And it was the story of how an entire system, police, society, even the public, allowed the pattern to continue, year after year, without intervention strong enough to stop it. The farm in Port Coquitlam became a place of horror almost overnight, but the truth is, it had been that way for a long time. It just took the right set of eyes, the right moment, for the illusion to collapse. And at the center of it all stood Robert Picton. Not running. Not hiding in some distant place. Right there. Where he had always been. The question was no longer whether he was involved. The question was how far it went. How many lives had passed through that property and never returned? How many stories had been cut short before anyone thought to listen? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, how many chances had there been to stop it before it became something so much bigger than anyone could comprehend? Because evil doesn't always arrive with warning signs. Sometimes, it settles in quietly. It builds itself into the background. And by the time anyone notices, it's already too late. If you follow the road east out of Vancouver long enough, the city begins to loosen its grip. The glass towers thin out, replaced by low buildings, then warehouses, then stretches of land that feel like they've been forgotten in the rapid expansion of everything else. The air changes first. It carries less exhaust, more damp earth. The soundscape shifts from traffic to something quieter, more scattered. A dog barking in the distance. The rustle of wind through trees. The faint, mechanical groan of farm equipment somewhere out of sight. And eventually, you reach Port Coquitlam. At a glance, it doesn't feel like the kind of place where something monstrous could hide for years. It's quiet, suburban in parts, edged by rural properties where land is cheap and privacy comes easily. People here mind their business. They wake up early, go to work, return home. Life moves at a slower, steadier rhythm than in the city. It's the kind of place where neighbors wave but don't necessarily ask questions. That distance, from curiosity, from scrutiny, is important. Because tucked into this landscape, just far enough away to avoid attention but close enough to remain connected, sat a property that didn't quite fit. A farm that looked less like a place of livelihood and more like something time had passed over and left behind. The Picton Farm. From the outside, it was unremarkable in the way that decay often is. Fences that leaned slightly off balance. Buildings that looked as though they had been patched together over decades rather than built with intention. The ground uneven, churned constantly by the movement of animals. Mud that clung to boots and refused to let go. There was always a smell. Not overwhelming at first, but persistent. A thick, organic scent that settled into the air and lingered longer than it should. For anyone familiar with farming, it might have been easy to dismiss. Livestock produces odors. Waste accumulates. That's normal. But there was something about this place that felt excessive. As if things were left to rot just a little too long. The pigs moved through the property with a kind of restless energy, rooting through the dirt, their bodies pressing against one another in tight spaces. They were large, powerful animals, capable of reducing almost anything to nothing if given enough time. Anyone who had worked with pigs knew that. It was a fact, not a myth. And yet, no one looked at them and thought of anything beyond livestock. Not then. The man who owned this land, Robert Picton, did not present himself as someone in control of something sinister. If anything, he seemed like a man barely managing what he already had. His appearance was often disheveled. His movements slightly awkward, as though he were never entirely comfortable in his own body. He spoke in a way that could feel distant, detached, but not alarming enough to leave a lasting impression. He blended in by being forgettable. But the farm did not exist in isolation from the rest of the world. There was a bridge between this quiet, rural property and one of the most vulnerable communities in Canada. Downtown East Side. Back in Vancouver, far from the open land and the illusion of quiet, downtown East Side pulsed with a different kind of energy. It was dense, crowded, alive in a way that felt both urgent and fragile. The streets were lined with aging buildings, many of them in disrepair. Neon signs flickered above doorways. Storefronts opened and closed unpredictably. People moved constantly, but rarely with purpose that extended beyond the next hour. It was a place where survival came first. Where addiction, poverty, and desperation intersected in ways that made stability almost impossible. For many women living there, options were limited. Some turned to sex work. Some relied on informal networks of support that could disappear as quickly as they formed. Trust was a rare and valuable commodity, often traded away out of necessity. And in that environment, disappearing wasn't always immediate cause for alarm. Someone gone for a few days might just be on a binge. Someone gone for a week might have found temporary shelter somewhere else. Even longer absences could be explained away, at least at first. It was a place where people slipped through cracks so easily that the cracks themselves stopped being noticed. This is where the two worlds met. Picton didn't hunt in the traditional sense. He didn't stalk from shadows or force his way into lives that were otherwise stable. He entered a space where instability was already the norm, where vulnerability was not hidden but visible on every street corner. He offered something simple. A ride. A party. Money. Drugs. Sometimes just attention. The proposition didn't need to be elaborate. It only needed to be enough. And for many, it was. The farm became a destination that existed just on the edge of rumor. People knew about it in the way that communities like downtown East Side always know about certain places. There were whispers of parties, of gatherings where the rules were loose and the expectations even looser. Music, alcohol, drugs. A temporary escape from the harshness of daily life. Some who went there came back. They talked about the chaos, the strange atmosphere, the sense that something wasn't quite right, even if they couldn't explain why. But unease is easy to ignore when weighed against immediate needs. If the night offered relief, even briefly, that was often enough. Others didn't come back. At first, their absence folded into the background noise of the neighborhood. But as the years passed, patterns began to emerge, not in official reports, but in conversations between those who paid attention. Outreach workers noticed familiar faces disappearing. Friends asked about people no one had seen in weeks. Families, when they could, reported missing loved ones, only to be met with responses that felt insufficient, delayed, or dismissive. There were moments, small, fleeting, when the truth almost surfaced. Tips were called in. Concerns were raised. The same location mentioned more than once. The same man's name appearing in different contexts, connected by nothing more than suspicion and unease. But suspicion alone isn't evidence. And without evidence, action stalled. Law enforcement, constrained by procedure and perception, did not move with the urgency the situation required. The victims, after all, did not fit the profile that typically triggers immediate, large-scale investigations. They were not seen as high risk in the conventional sense, even though their lives were, in reality, defined by risk. This disconnect created space. And in that space, time stretched on. The farm continued to operate. The pigs were fed. The fences stood. The buildings decayed a little more each year. And beneath it all, hidden from view, something was accumulating. Not just evidence, but absence. The absence of dozens of women whose lives intersected, however briefly, with a place that should have raised more questions than it did. It's easy, in retrospect, to look at the setting and see it as obvious. To point at the isolation of the farm, the vulnerability of the victims, the missed signals, and wonder how it could have gone unnoticed for so long. But reality is rarely that clear in the moment. It's made up of fragments. Incomplete information. Assumptions that feel reasonable at the time. Systems that function well enough in most cases, but fail catastrophically in others. In the space between Vancouver and Port Coquitlam, between downtown East Side and the Picton Farm, those fragments never quite came together, at least not when they needed to. And so the setting remained unchanged. A quiet stretch of land. A community struggling to survive. A man moving between both, unnoticed in the ways that mattered most. Until, eventually, something forced the world to look closer. But by then, the story had already been written across years of silence, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally see it for what it was. In stories like this, there is always a risk, a quiet, insidious shift in focus where the name of the killer becomes the center of gravity, pulling everything else into its orbit. Faces blur. Lives compress into numbers. And the people who were lost are remembered not for who they were, but for how they died. But long before anyone ever spoke the name Robert Picton in a courtroom, long before investigators began to piece together what had happened on that farm outside Vancouver, there were women whose lives stretched far beyond the narrow frame in which history would eventually try to hold them. They had names. They had voices. They had moments of joy so small and ordinary that no one thought to preserve them, and moments of pain so heavy that they shaped the course of everything that came after. Some of them grew up in homes where laughter came easily, at least in the beginning. Childhoods marked by scraped knees, shared meals, schoolyards, and dreams that felt attainable simply because no one had told them otherwise yet. Others entered the world already carrying weight, family instability, poverty, the kind of early fractures that don't always show on the surface but alter everything beneath. For many, the path toward downtown East Side was not a single decision, but a series of small turns. A job lost. A relationship that turned violent. A dependency that began as an escape and slowly became a necessity. Each step, on its own, might not have seemed final. But together, they formed a current that was difficult to fight against. And so they arrived in a neighborhood where survival required constant negotiation. In downtown East Side, time moved differently. Days blurred into nights, and nights stretched endlessly under the glow of streetlights that never quite made the darkness feel safe. People learned quickly who to trust and who to avoid. They learned where to go for help and where not to go at all. They built fragile networks, friends who watched out for each other when they could, who shared what little they had, who understood without needing explanations. Among them were women like Serena Abotsway, whose smile, in photographs, carried a warmth that resisted the narrative the world would later impose on her. She had family. She had people who remembered her not as a statistic, but as someone who laughed, who argued, who existed in ways that were messy and human and real. There was Mona Wilson, who navigated a life shaped by both resilience and vulnerability, moving through a system that often failed to see her as anything more than a problem to be managed. There was Marnie Fry, whose youth made her disappearance all the more jarring to those who knew her, a reminder of how quickly a life could veer off course. Each woman carried her own story, her own set of circumstances that led her to the same streets, the same intersections, the same unspoken understanding of what it took to get through the day. They were not invisible to each other. That's what makes what happened next so haunting. Because within their community, absence was noticed. It might not have triggered immediate action from authorities, but among friends, among those who shared the same spaces, the same routines, the same risks, it registered in ways that were deeply personal. Someone didn't show up where they usually did. Someone's usual spot on the sidewalk remained empty. Someone's name came up in conversation, followed by a pause, followed by a quiet acknowledgement that no one had seen them in a while. At first, there were explanations. There are always explanations. Maybe she found a safer place to stay. Maybe she left the city. Maybe she got clean. Maybe she didn't want to be found. In a place where instability was constant, these possibilities felt plausible enough to hold on to. But over time, those explanations began to wear thin. Because it wasn't just one person. It was many. Women who knew each other. Women who moved in overlapping circles. Women who, despite the chaos of their lives, maintained connections strong enough that their sudden, complete disappearance felt wrong in a way that couldn't be easily dismissed. Families felt it too, when they could reach across the distance that often separated them from their loved ones. A mother calling a number that no longer connected. A sister asking around, piecing together fragments of information that didn't quite add up. A father holding on to the last memory he had, replaying it over and over, searching for something he might have missed. The responses they received were often slow, procedural, lacking the urgency that grief demands. Missing persons reports filed, but not always acted upon with the speed or intensity that might have made a difference. Assumptions made about lifestyles, about choices, about the likelihood that these women had simply drifted away. And in that gap, between concern and action, between disappearance and investigation, time continued to move forward. For the women themselves, the moments leading up to their final days were, in many cases, indistinguishable from the countless days that came before. A conversation on a street corner. A negotiation that needed to be made. A decision to accept a ride, an offer, an opportunity that might make the night a little easier. The man offering that opportunity did not arrive with violence. Not at first. He arrived with familiarity. A face that had been seen before. A presence that didn't immediately trigger alarm. In environments like downtown East Side, where interactions with strangers were a daily reality, the threshold for trust was different. It had to be. Absolute suspicion of everyone was not sustainable. So when Robert Picton extended an invitation, whether it was framed as a party, a chance to earn money, or simply a ride away from the streets, it didn't stand out as inherently dangerous. It was just another choice in a series of choices that defined daily survival. What makes this part of the story so difficult to confront is not just what happened, but how ordinary it must have felt in the moment. There was no clear line, no obvious point where everything shifted from routine to irreversible. No alarm that sounded loud enough to override the immediate needs of the present. For some, there may have been hesitation. A moment of doubt. A flicker of instinct that something wasn't right. But instinct is often quiet, and necessity is loud. And so they went. They stepped into a vehicle, onto a property, into a space that would become the last place they were ever seen. What followed is not defined by a single narrative, because each woman's experience, each sequence of events, remains partially obscured by time, by the destruction of evidence, by the limitations of what can be reconstructed after the fact. But what is clear is this: they did not simply vanish. Their lives were interrupted. Taken. Reduced, in the eyes of the system that failed them, to missing entries in reports that did not carry the weight they deserved. Yet even in that reduction, traces of who they were remain. In photographs held by families who refused to forget. In stories shared by those who knew them before the world narrowed their identities to a single, tragic endpoint. In the quiet insistence that they were more than the circumstances that led them to downtown East Side, more than the vulnerabilities that were exploited, more than the silence that followed their disappearance. To understand this case, to fully grasp the magnitude of what happened on that farm, it is not enough to focus on the man at its center. You have to see the women. Not as a collective, not as a statistic, but as individuals whose lives intersected with his in the worst possible way. Because each name represents a story that was still being written. Each disappearance marks a moment where that story was forcibly cut short. And each unanswered question is a reminder of how much was lost, not just in terms of life, but in terms of possibility, of futures that will never unfold, of versions of themselves that the world will never get to know. This is not just a case about death. It is a case about absence. And the kind of absence that echoes long after the world finally begins to pay attention. There is no single night you can point to and say, this is when it began. No clean origin, no moment where the line between before and after is clearly drawn. What happened on that farm outside Vancouver did not erupt all at once. It unfolded slowly, quietly, repetition layered on repetition until the pattern became something vast and nearly impossible to see from the outside. But if you narrow your focus, if you follow just one thread, one woman, one final set of hours, you begin to understand how it worked. It starts like so many other nights in downtown East Side. The air carries a damp chill, the kind that settles into clothing and doesn't leave. Streetlights cast a dull orange glow across cracked sidewalks. Conversations rise and fall in fragments, half-finished sentences, negotiations, laughter that sounds more like habit than joy. People move in familiar loops, returning to the same corners, the same doorways, the same routines that define survival here. She is there among them. Maybe she's been awake too long. Maybe she hasn't eaten enough. Maybe she's trying not to think too far ahead, because thinking too far ahead makes everything harder. What matters is now. The next hour. The next opportunity. She knows the risks. Everyone here does. Danger is not an abstract concept, it's woven into daily life. But risk is something you learn to calculate, to manage, to weigh against necessity. And then he appears. Robert Picton does not stand out in the way you might expect. There is no dramatic entrance, no visible threat. He looks like someone who belongs to the edges of places like this. A man slightly out of place, but not enough to draw attention. Someone who has been seen before, perhaps in passing, perhaps in moments that seem too insignificant to remember clearly. He speaks in a way that is unremarkable. Casual. Almost hesitant. An offer is made. It could be framed as a ride. A chance to get off the street for a while. Maybe there's mention of a party, of other people, of alcohol, of something that feels like a break from the monotony. Sometimes there is money involved. Sometimes something else, something that feels, in that moment, worth the risk. There is a pause. A decision. This is where everything hinges on something so small it would be invisible to anyone watching from the outside. A nod. A step forward. The opening of a car door. And then she is gone from the street. The drive out of the city is not long, but it feels like a transition between two different worlds. The density of downtown East Side gives way to open roads. The noise fades. The lights thin out. What replaces them is space, wide, quiet, indifferent space that doesn't ask questions and doesn't offer help. Inside the vehicle, conversation may continue. Or it may not. Silence, in moments like this, is not unusual. It doesn't necessarily signal danger. Not yet. The farm appears gradually, emerging from the darkness as a collection of shapes rather than a single structure. Fences. Buildings. Movement that is difficult to interpret at first glance. To someone arriving for the first time, it might feel strange. Not immediately threatening, but off in a way that is hard to define. The kind of place where things don't quite align with expectations, where details seem slightly wrong but not wrong enough to justify turning back. And turning back, at this point, is no longer simple. What happens next is not captured in a single narrative. There are no witnesses who can describe each moment with certainty, no recordings that document the sequence from beginning to end. What exists instead are fragments, evidence recovered later, patterns identified across multiple cases, details that, when assembled, suggest a method that was both calculated and disturbingly consistent. Inside the structures on the property, the environment shifts again. Closer. More contained. The outside world feels distant, almost irrelevant. At some point, the dynamic changes. The offer that brought her here no longer holds. The sense of control shifts, subtly at first, then completely. What may have seemed like an interaction between two people becomes something else entirely, something defined by imbalance, by isolation, by the absence of any immediate possibility of escape. There may have been confusion. Questions asked that did not receive answers. Moments where realization began to form, slow and disbelieving. Because the mind does not immediately jump to the worst possible conclusion. It searches for explanations that make sense within the framework of normal experience. It tries to interpret what is happening in ways that allow for resolution, for de-escalation. But there are situations where those frameworks collapse. Where the reality of what is unfolding cannot be softened or rationalized. And in those moments, time behaves differently. Seconds stretch. Details become sharper, more pronounced. The texture of a surface. The angle of a shadow. The sound of movement in another part of the building. Things that would otherwise go unnoticed become fixed points in a memory that is being formed under extreme stress. What is known, based on evidence and later findings, is that once these women were brought to the farm, they did not leave. Their final moments were contained within that space, removed from the world that had already begun to forget them. What makes this pattern particularly chilling is not just the violence itself, but the repetition of it. This was not an isolated incident. It was a process. One that was repeated enough times to suggest a level of familiarity, of routine. Each instance building upon the last, each disappearance adding to a growing absence that remained, for years, unaddressed. And outside of the farm, life continued. In downtown East Side, people still moved through their routines. They still made decisions based on immediate needs. They still encountered the same man, in some cases, without knowing what had already happened, without knowing that others had made the same choice and never returned. There is a particular kind of horror in that continuity. In the idea that the world does not stop, does not shift dramatically, even as something deeply wrong is happening just beyond its awareness. The farm remained just another place. The man remained just another figure on the margins. The disappearances remained, for too long, just that, disappearances. No definitive link. No urgent intervention. No moment where everything snapped into focus and forced action. Instead, there was a slow accumulation. A pattern that existed, but was not fully seen. And within that pattern, individual stories ended in the same place, under the same circumstances, their details blurred by time and the destruction that followed. It is difficult to confront the reality of those moments, not because they are unknowable, but because they are partially known. Enough to understand the trajectory. Enough to recognize the intent. But not enough to reconstruct every second, every thought, every attempt to make sense of what was happening. And perhaps that is part of what makes this case linger. The gaps. The spaces where answers should be, but aren't. The understanding that each of these incidents was not just an event, but the end of a life that had been moving, changing, evolving up until that point. Lives that intersected with one man, in one place, under circumstances that seemed, at first, no different from countless others. Until they were. And by the time anyone began to fully grasp what had been happening, those moments were already far beyond reach, locked into a past that could be examined, but never undone. The farm stood. The pattern continued. And the incidents, one after another, remained hidden behind a silence that would take years to break. The first sign that something was wrong did not arrive with clarity. It never does. It came instead as something small, almost dismissible, the kind of detail that might have slipped past unnoticed if circumstances had been only slightly different. In early 2002, authorities arrived at the rural property owned by Robert Picton in Port Coquitlam, just outside Vancouver, not in pursuit of a serial killer, but in search of illegal firearms. It was routine. Procedural. The kind of warrant served countless times before, expected to yield nothing more than confirmation of a separate, contained offense. No one stepped onto that land expecting to uncover the outline of something far larger. The property itself did not immediately resist inspection. It was messy, disorganized, layered with years of neglect that made it difficult to distinguish between what was ordinary for a farm and what was not. Tools lay scattered. Equipment rusted in place. Structures leaned under the weight of time and weather. The ground, churned constantly by livestock, bore the marks of repeated disturbance, but nothing that would immediately suggest intent beyond agriculture. But investigators are trained to notice when something doesn't fit. It began with items that didn't belong. Personal effects, subtle at first, appearing in places where they had no clear reason to be. Objects that suggested the presence of people who did not live there, who were not accounted for by the man who owned the land. At a glance, they could have been dismissed as remnants of visitors, of the gatherings that were known to occur on the property. But there was something about their distribution, their condition, that resisted easy explanation. Then came the biological evidence. It did not present itself dramatically. There was no singular moment where the full scope of the situation revealed itself all at once. Instead, it emerged piece by piece, each fragment raising questions that led to more careful examination, more thorough searches, more attention directed at areas that might otherwise have been overlooked. The soil, when disturbed, did not behave as expected. Certain sections appeared inconsistent, as though they had been altered, led in ways that did not align with routine farming practices. Investigators began to dig, cautiously at first, then with increasing focus as what they uncovered refused to fit within the boundaries of the original search. Fragments. Not immediately identifiable, not immediately understood, but enough to halt the momentum of the initial investigation and redirect it entirely. Enough to suggest that this was no longer about weapons. The farm began to transform in the eyes of those examining it. What had been a site of routine inspection became something else entirely, a space that required containment, documentation, preservation. Additional personnel were brought in. Forensic specialists. Teams equipped to handle the possibility that what lay beneath the surface extended far beyond a single incident. As the search expanded, the pattern began to emerge. More fragments. More evidence. Each discovery adding to a growing sense that the property itself held a history that had been concealed not through sophistication, but through neglect, isolation, and the assumption that nothing significant could be hidden in a place that looked so unremarkable. DNA analysis became a critical component of the investigation. Samples collected from various locations across the property were processed, compared, cross-referenced with existing databases and missing persons reports. The results did not come back all at once. They arrived gradually, each confirmation adding weight to a conclusion that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Multiple identities. Women who had been reported missing over the years, whose cases had not been connected in any meaningful way, whose disappearances had been treated as isolated events, began to converge within the same space. The same property. The same man. The realization did not arrive with certainty at first. Investigators are cautious by necessity, trained to avoid premature conclusions. But as the evidence accumulated, as the number of matches increased, as the fragments formed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence, the scope of what they were dealing with began to take shape. This was not a single crime scene. It was many. Layered over time, overlapping, obscured by the very environment in which they had occurred. The challenges of processing the site were immense. The presence of livestock had altered the landscape in ways that complicated recovery efforts. Organic material decomposed at varying rates. Soil conditions shifted. Evidence that might have been preserved in a different environment had been degraded, dispersed, or rendered difficult to interpret. And yet, despite these obstacles, enough remained. Enough to identify. Enough to connect. Enough to begin reconstructing a timeline that stretched back years, encompassing disappearances that had, until this point, existed only as separate entries in reports that had not been given the urgency they deserved. Outside the property, the world began to take notice. News of the investigation spread, at first cautiously, then with increasing intensity as details emerged. The idea that such a site could exist, so close to a major city, undetected for so long, captured public attention in a way that few cases do. Media coverage intensified. Questions were asked about the investigation, about the victims, about the systems that had failed to recognize the pattern earlier. But within the boundaries of the farm, the work remained methodical. Careful. Each piece of evidence documented, catalogued, analyzed. Each discovery treated not as an isolated finding, but as part of a larger narrative that was still being assembled. Investigators moved through the property with a growing awareness of its significance. Areas that might once have been overlooked were examined in detail. Structures were searched thoroughly. Containers, equipment, spaces that could conceal or obscure evidence were opened, inspected, processed. The scale of the operation expanded accordingly. What had begun as a localized search evolved into one of the most extensive forensic investigations in Canadian history. Resources were allocated. Timeframes extended. The understanding that this was not a case that could be resolved quickly became apparent early in the process. And at the center of it all was the man who owned the land. Robert Picton did not disappear when the investigation began. He did not flee, did not attempt to distance himself from the property in any obvious way. He remained present, his connection to the site undeniable, his role within the unfolding situation becoming increasingly difficult to interpret as anything other than central. But the investigation was not built on assumption. It was built on evidence. And the evidence continued to accumulate. DNA profiles linked to multiple missing women. Personal belongings identified by families. Items that confirmed, with increasing certainty, that the individuals who had once owned them had been present on the property, had not left, had become part of the environment in ways that defied comprehension. The farm, once just a place, became a repository of absence. Each discovery a reminder of a life interrupted. Each identification a confirmation that the pattern, once only suspected, was real. For the families of the missing, the investigation brought a complicated form of resolution. Answers, in the sense that the uncertainty of not knowing began to give way to confirmation. But those answers came with a weight that is difficult to articulate. The shift from hoping for a return to confronting the reality of loss is not a clean transition. It is layered, conflicting, filled with moments where certainty feels both necessary and unbearable. For the broader public, the case forced a confrontation with uncomfortable truths. About who is noticed when they go missing. About how patterns can exist without being recognized. about the ways in which environments, both physical and social, can conceal what is happening within them. And for investigators, the work continued. Because discovery is not the end of a case. It is the beginning of understanding. The farm had yielded its first secrets, but many remained. Hidden in the soil. Embedded in the structures. Waiting to be uncovered, documented, and, ultimately, brought into a narrative that could explain not just what had happened, but how it had been allowed to continue for so long without interruption. The illusion of normalcy had been broken. What remained was the task of piecing together the truth from what had been left behind. And that truth was far more complex, far more extensive, than anyone had anticipated when they first stepped onto that land with a warrant that had nothing to do with murder. By the time the property in Port Coquitlam was formally recognized as more than a routine search site, the investigation had already outgrown its original boundaries. What began as a narrow inquiry into illegal weapons had expanded into something vast, complex, and deeply unsettling. The name Robert Picton was no longer just attached to a piece of land outside Vancouver. It was now at the center of a case that demanded answers stretching back over a decade. But investigations of this scale do not move in straight lines. They move in fragments, in competing theories, in directions that sometimes lead nowhere at all. In the early stages, even with the mounting evidence from the farm, there was still a fundamental question that had to be answered carefully and methodically: was this the work of one man, or something larger? The sheer number of potential victims complicated everything. Cases involving multiple disappearances often raise the possibility of networks, of accomplices, of systems that extend beyond a single individual. Investigators could not afford to assume simplicity where complexity might exist. So they widened the lens. They began tracing connections outward from the farm, mapping relationships, movements, histories. Every person known to have visited the property became a point of interest. Friends, acquaintances, casual visitors, individuals who had attended the chaotic gatherings that had become part of the farm's reputation. Names were collected, cross-referenced, re-examined. Interviews followed. Some people spoke willingly. Others hesitated, wary of law enforcement, shaped by years of interaction with systems that had not always treated them fairly. In communities like downtown East Side, trust is not given easily, especially not to authorities. That hesitation slowed progress, created gaps in timelines, left certain questions unanswered. And in those gaps, alternative theories began to form. There were those who believed Picton could not have acted alone. The logistics seemed overwhelming. The scale of the evidence suggested a process that, to some, felt too extensive for a single person to manage over such a long period. Rumors circulated about others who might have been involved, about individuals who had been seen at the farm under suspicious circumstances, about activities that extended beyond what could be directly proven. Investigators had to consider all of it. Every lead, no matter how unlikely, required evaluation. Time was spent following threads that eventually unraveled into nothing. Witness statements that contradicted each other. Memories distorted by time, by substance use, by trauma. Descriptions that changed depending on who was asked and when. It created a landscape of uncertainty. At the same time, the forensic work continued relentlessly. The property itself remained an active crime scene for months, then years. Evidence was processed at a pace dictated not by urgency alone, but by the limitations of what could be extracted from an environment that had degraded so much of what it contained. Each fragment had to be analyzed, each sample tested, each result verified. DNA became both a tool and a challenge. Matches linked the site to multiple missing women, but identification did not always come easily. Some remains were too fragmented. Some profiles incomplete. Investigators worked with families, collecting reference samples, building a database that could support the painstaking process of confirmation. With each identification, the weight of the case grew. Not just in numbers, but in complexity. Because every victim brought with her a separate timeline, a separate set of last known movements, last known contacts, last known moments before disappearance. Reconstructing those timelines required going back years, revisiting old reports, re-interviewing witnesses, re-examining evidence that had once been considered insufficient. Patterns began to solidify. Picton's presence appeared repeatedly in proximity to the missing. Not always directly, not always in ways that could be immediately proven, but enough to establish a consistent link. He had been seen with some of the women. He had been mentioned in tips that, at the time, had not been fully pursued. His name surfaced in contexts that, when viewed individually, might not have warranted action, but collectively formed something far more significant. This raised another, more difficult question. Why hadn't these connections been made earlier? As investigators dug deeper, they encountered the history of the missing persons cases themselves. Reports that had been filed, sometimes delayed. Follow-ups that had been limited in scope. Leads that had not been fully explored. It was not a single failure, but a series of small decisions, each one understandable in isolation, that together created a system where the pattern could exist without triggering a comprehensive response. This realization did not simplify the investigation. It complicated it. Because now, in addition to building a case against a suspect, there was an implicit need to understand the broader context in which the crimes had occurred. The environment that allowed them to continue. The institutional limitations that had delayed recognition. Meanwhile, public attention intensified. Media coverage expanded, often faster than verified information could be released. Speculation filled the gaps. The number of potential victims became a point of focus, with estimates ranging far beyond what could be confirmed in court. The image of the farm shifted from a crime scene to something almost mythologized, its reality shaped as much by public imagination as by documented evidence. This created pressure on investigators to produce answers, on prosecutors to build a case that could withstand scrutiny, on everyone involved to navigate the space between what was known, what was suspected, and what could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. Within that space, decisions had to be made. Which charges to pursue first? How to structure the case? How to present evidence that was, by its nature, fragmented and complex? The sheer volume of material meant that not everything could be addressed at once. Prioritization became necessary, even when it meant leaving certain aspects of the case unresolved, at least temporarily. At the center of it all, Robert Picton remained the focal point. His behavior during the investigation did not align with what might be expected in a case of this magnitude. There was no dramatic denial, no elaborate attempt to construct an alternative narrative. Instead, there were inconsistencies, statements that shifted, details that did not align with the evidence being uncovered. Interrogation sought to clarify those inconsistencies, to establish timelines, to identify points where his account diverged from what could be independently verified. But even here, progress was not immediate. Information came slowly, if at all. And investigators had to rely not on confession, but on the accumulation of physical evidence, witness testimony, and forensic analysis. As the months passed, the outline of the case became clearer, but not simpler. It was not a single thread to be followed from beginning to end, but a web of interconnected elements, each one requiring attention, each one contributing to a broader understanding that was still incomplete. The possibility of additional victims remained. Names that had not yet been linked through DNA. Disappearances that fit the pattern but lacked direct evidence connecting them to the farm. The investigation had to hold space for those possibilities, even as it moved forward with what could be proven. And so it continued. Methodical. Relentless. Marked by progress that was often incremental, measured not in breakthroughs, but in a slow accumulation of facts that, together, formed a case strong enough to move toward prosecution. But before that could happen, before the story could shift from investigation to judgment, there needed to be something more. A point where the uncertainty narrowed. A moment where the fragments aligned just enough to create clarity. Because without that, the case risked remaining what it had been for so long, an outline without a center, a pattern without definitive confirmation, a truth that was visible, but not yet fully established. And in a case like this, that difference matters. There is a moment in every long investigation when the weight of uncertainty begins to shift. It doesn't happen all at once. There is no single revelation that suddenly illuminates everything that came before. Instead, it feels more like a slow tightening, as if the edges of the case are being drawn inward, narrowing the space in which doubt can exist. For the investigators working the case centered around Robert Picton, that shift came not from a single piece of evidence, but from the convergence of many. By this point, the farm outside Vancouver had already yielded a disturbing volume of forensic material. DNA profiles had linked the property to multiple missing women. Personal belongings had been identified. Patterns had been established. But patterns alone are not enough in a courtroom. What the case needed, what every case of this magnitude requires, was something that could anchor the narrative. Something that moved beyond implication and into undeniable connection. Something that could take the vast, fragmented landscape of evidence and shape it into a story that could be presented, understood, and ultimately judged. That process began with refinement. Investigators and forensic analysts returned to the evidence, not to collect more, but to understand what they already had at a deeper level. Each sample, each fragment, each data point was re-examined with a focus that went beyond identification. They were no longer just asking who these remains belonged to. They were asking how they got there, when, and under what circumstances. Timelines became critical. Establishing when specific individuals had last been seen, and aligning those timelines with Picton's known movements, began to reveal overlaps that were difficult to dismiss. Witnesses who had previously provided vague or uncertain statements were re-interviewed, this time with the benefit of additional context. Details that had once seemed insignificant began to take on new meaning when placed alongside emerging patterns. One of the most important elements of the breakthrough came from the intersection of physical evidence and human testimony. Individually, each could be challenged. Together, they reinforced each other. Witnesses placed certain women in proximity to Picton shortly before their disappearances. Others described the environment of the farm in ways that aligned with what investigators had observed firsthand. Accounts of gatherings, of interactions, of moments that had once seemed ordinary were now viewed through a different lens. Not every statement was reliable. That was part of the challenge. Memories fade. They shift. They are influenced by time, by trauma, by external narratives. Investigators had to sift through inconsistencies, separating what could be corroborated from what could not. It was a meticulous process, one that required patience and restraint. At the same time, advancements in forensic analysis provided additional clarity. DNA evidence, already central to the case, was further refined. Profiles were strengthened. Matches that had once been tentative became more definitive. The presence of multiple victims on the property was no longer a question of probability. It was a matter of record. And then there were the items. Personal belongings recovered from the farm that could be directly linked to specific individuals. Clothing. Identification. Objects that carried with them a chain of ownership that could be traced, verified, and presented as evidence of presence. These were not abstract data points. They were tangible. They connected the victims to the location in a way that could be seen, understood, and, most importantly, believed. As the case tightened, the focus on Picton intensified. Interrogations, already conducted in earlier stages, were revisited. Statements he had made were compared against the growing body of evidence. Inconsistencies became more pronounced. Explanations that might have seemed plausible in isolation began to unravel when viewed in the context of what was now known. There were moments during questioning where the line between denial and inadvertent admission blurred. Not in the form of a clear confession, but in fragments, statements that suggested knowledge he should not have had, responses that implied familiarity with details that had not been publicly disclosed. These moments were critical. They did not stand alone, but when combined with the physical evidence, they contributed to a narrative that was becoming increasingly difficult to challenge. Still, the investigation did not rush forward. Caution remained essential. The scale of the case meant that any misstep could have significant consequences. Evidence had to be handled with precision. Procedures had to be followed without deviation. The integrity of the process was as important as the outcome. Behind the scenes, legal teams began to prepare. Prosecutors worked closely with investigators to determine how best to present the case. Which charges to prioritize? Which evidence to introduce first? How to construct a sequence that would guide a jury through the complexity without overwhelming them. This was not a case that could rely on a single, dramatic piece of evidence. It required accumulation, layering, a deliberate building of understanding, step by step, until the conclusion became not just plausible, but inevitable. At the same time, the question of scope remained. How many victims could be included in the initial charges? The evidence suggested a number far greater than what could be practically addressed in a single trial. Decisions had to be made, difficult ones, about where to begin. Which cases had the strongest evidentiary support? Which could be proven beyond reasonable doubt with the material available? These decisions were not about minimizing the others. They were about strategy. About ensuring that the case presented would hold, that it would lead to a conviction that could serve as a foundation for addressing the broader scope later. As these elements came together, the investigation reached a point where the narrative could no longer be fragmented. It had a center. It had direction. The farm was no longer just a site where evidence had been found. It was established as a location where multiple victims had been present and had not left. Pick-Tun was no longer just a person of interest. He was positioned, through a combination of forensic evidence, witness testimony, and his own statements, as the individual responsible for what had occurred there. The breakthrough, then, was not a single discovery. It was the moment when everything aligned. When the gaps between pieces of evidence closed just enough to form a coherent, prosecutable case. When the investigation transitioned from searching for answers to preparing to present them. For those who had been following the case from the beginning, from the early days of missing persons reports that had not been fully connected, through the discovery of the farm, through the long, methodical process of evidence collection, this shift carried a sense of movement. Not closure. Not yet. But movement toward something definitive. Because the next phase would take everything that had been uncovered, everything that had been analyzed, and place it in a setting where it would be tested. Where the narrative would be challenged. Where the evidence would be scrutinized. Where the question of responsibility would be answered not by investigators, but by a court of law. And in that transition, the case would move from the realm of investigation into something else entirely. Judgment. By the time the case reached the courtroom, it was no longer just an investigation. It had become something heavier, something that carried not only evidence, but expectation. Years of silence, years of missed connections, years of absence had led to this moment. Inside a courtroom in British Columbia, the name Robert Pick-Tun was no longer spoken in speculation or suspicion. It was spoken with the full weight of accusation. The setting could not have been more different from the farm outside Vancouver. Where the property had been chaotic, unstructured, layered with decay and secrecy, the courtroom was defined by order. Clean lines. Controlled movement. Every word recorded, every action observed. It was a space designed to impose clarity, to take something as sprawling and complex as this case and distill it into a sequence that could be understood, evaluated, and judged. But clarity, in a case like this, is not easily achieved. The prosecution faced a challenge that went beyond simply presenting evidence. They had to tell a story, one that connected fragments, one that transformed years of investigation into a coherent narrative that a jury could follow without losing sight of its significance. They had to take forensic data, witness testimony, timelines, and physical evidence, and shape them into something that made sense not just logically, but emotionally. Because at its core, this case was not just about what could be proven. It was about what had happened. And what had happened was difficult to confront. The decision had been made to proceed with a limited number of charges initially. 6 counts of second-degree murder. Not because there were only 6 victims, but because these were the cases where the evidence was strongest, where the connections between Pick-Tun, the victims, and the farm could be established with the level of certainty required in a criminal trial. Even so, the scope of the case loomed over every moment of the proceedings. From the beginning, the prosecution moved deliberately. They introduced the victims not as abstractions, but as individuals. Names were spoken. Histories outlined. Not in exhaustive detail, but enough to establish that these were lives, not just entries in a report. Women who had existed, who had moved through the world, who had been seen and known before they disappeared. Then came the evidence. It was presented piece by piece, each element building upon the last. Forensic experts took the stand, explaining in careful, precise language how DNA had been recovered from the farm, how it had been analyzed, how it had been matched to specific individuals. The science was complex, but it was delivered in a way that emphasized its reliability, its objectivity. This was not speculation. This was measurable, testable, repeatable. The jury was guided through the process, shown how conclusions had been reached, how the presence of multiple victims on the property had been established beyond reasonable doubt. Then came the physical evidence. Items recovered from the farm were presented, each one linked to a victim, each one reinforcing the connection between the missing and the location. These were tangible things, objects that had once been part of someone's daily life, now serving as silent witnesses to what had occurred. Witnesses followed. Some spoke of seeing the victims in the days before they disappeared. Others described interactions with Picton, moments that, at the time, had seemed ordinary but now carried a different weight. There were accounts of the farm itself, of its atmosphere, of the gatherings that had taken place there. Not every testimony was definitive. Some were fragmented, uncertain. But together, they formed a pattern that aligned with the physical evidence, reinforcing the narrative the prosecution was building. Throughout this, Picton sat in the courtroom. Present. Visible. Not as a distant figure described in reports, but as a man whose life intersected directly with the evidence being presented. His demeanor, his reactions, his stillness, everything about him was observed, interpreted, discussed. The defense faced a different challenge. They did not need to prove an alternative narrative. They needed only to introduce doubt. To question the reliability of the evidence, to highlight inconsistencies, to suggest that the conclusions being drawn were not the only possible interpretations. They focused on the complexity of the case, on the condition of the evidence, on the environment in which it had been found. They questioned the handling of forensic material, the potential for contamination, the limitations of what could be definitively established given the state of the remains. They pointed to the absence of direct witnesses to the acts themselves. No one had seen the murders occur. No one could describe, with certainty, the exact sequence of events that led to each victim's death. In a criminal trial, that absence matters. It creates space. Space for doubt. Space for alternative explanations. The defense also raised the possibility, however indirectly, that others could have been involved. That the scale of what had been uncovered suggested something beyond the actions of a single individual. It was not a fully developed argument, but it was enough to introduce uncertainty, to complicate the narrative. And so the trial moved forward, day by day, detail by detail. For the families of the victims, the courtroom was a place of confrontation. Not just with the man accused, but with the evidence itself. The details of what had been found, the implications of those findings, the confirmation of losses that had once existed in a space of uncertainty. Grief, in that setting, is not private. It is visible. Contained, perhaps, but present in every moment. For the jury, the responsibility was immense. They were not just listening to a story. They were being asked to decide. To weigh evidence that was both technical and emotional. To navigate the space between what was known and what could be proven. To determine whether the case presented met the standard required for conviction. When the time came for deliberation, the courtroom shifted. The arguments had been made. The evidence presented. What remained was judgment. Those hours, those days, carried a different kind of tension. One that did not rely on new information, but on the interpretation of everything that had already been laid out. And then, the verdict. Guilty. 6 counts of second-degree murder. The decision did not encompass the full scope of what had been suspected, what had been implied by the investigation. But it established something critical. Responsibility. The court had determined that Robert Pickton was accountable for the deaths of 6 women. That the evidence presented was sufficient, that the narrative constructed by the prosecution held. The sentencing followed. Life imprisonment. A sentence that ensured he would remain confined, removed from the world in which his crimes had taken place. But even in that moment, there was an understanding that this was not the end. The case, by its nature, extended beyond the 6 convictions. The investigation had suggested more, had uncovered evidence that pointed to a broader pattern, a larger number of victims. Yet the justice system operates within constraints. What can be proven? What can be presented? What can be decided? For many, the verdict brought a measure of closure. Not complete. Not sufficient to account for everything that had been lost. But a recognition. An acknowledgement that what had happened mattered, that it had been seen, examined, judged. For others, it raised further questions. About the victims who were not part of the trial. About the full extent of the crimes. About the years that had passed before action was taken. Justice, in this case, was not a simple resolution. It was a step. A necessary one, but not one that erased what had come before. The courtroom emptied. The formal process concluded. But the story did not end there. Because what had been revealed in that space extended beyond the actions of one man, beyond the boundaries of one trial. It reached into the systems that had failed, the communities that had been affected, the lives that had been altered in ways that could not be undone. And those are not things that a verdict, no matter how definitive, can fully resolve. When the gavel fell and the courtroom emptied, what remained was not just a convicted man. What lingered was a landscape of absence, a void stitched together by the stories of women who had vanished and by the families who had waited years for answers that arrived too late. Robert Pickton was taken into custody to serve his sentence, but the consequences of his crimes rippled outward, far beyond the prison walls. Each day that passed in the quiet of downtown East Side reminded the community that these losses could never be fully quantified, that the echoes of these disappearances would remain, shaping lives long after formal judgment had been rendered. Families faced a complex and bitter form of closure. They had confirmation, proof that their loved ones had been among the victims, but the relief that comes from knowing was entangled with grief that refused to ease. For some, there was the crushing weight of imagining the final moments of those lives, the fear, the confusion, the helplessness. The thought of bodies hidden, of lives extinguished within spaces so close to ordinary existence, made reconciliation with reality agonizingly difficult. Even as the legal system had acted, the personal reckoning continued. Memories, photographs, stories of ordinary moments before disappearance became fragments of an unfinished narrative, each one carrying the double weight of life remembered and life lost. The public response was similarly profound. In Canada, the case of Pickton exposed systemic failures, highlighting how vulnerabilities could be overlooked by institutions meant to protect citizens. It sparked debates about how society treats marginalized populations, particularly women involved in sex work or struggling with addiction. The fact that so many victims had been dismissed, ignored, or deprioritized for years provoked outrage, reflection, and reform. Investigations into the conduct of law enforcement agencies were launched, and policies regarding missing persons were revised. The case forced a reckoning not just with the crimes themselves, but with the mechanisms of oversight, communication, and social accountability that had allowed them to continue unchecked. The psychological aftermath was equally stark. For the families and friends of the victims, trauma persisted in ways that the courtroom could not address. Counseling and community support became crucial, as did efforts to preserve memory and dignity for those who had been silenced. For survivors and witnesses, fear and distrust lingered. People who had interacted with Pickton, sometimes unknowingly, carried residual anxiety, guilt, or shame. Even in neighborhoods long familiar, the ordinary rhythms of daily life had been transformed by the knowledge that violence had occurred just beneath the surface of everyday interactions. Within the criminal justice system, the case became a reference point. It demonstrated both the capacity for meticulous investigative work and the consequences of procedural delays. Forensic teams, prosecutors, and law enforcement learned that patterns of disappearance must be recognized early, that no missing person can be dismissed, and that the accumulation of small, seemingly unconnected events can conceal large-scale crimes. Training protocols were updated, and multidisciplinary approaches were encouraged, emphasizing the importance of listening to communities, collaborating with social services, and tracking trends that might otherwise go unnoticed. In this sense, the legacy of the Picton investigation was both tragic and instructive, the grim reminder of what can occur when vigilance falters and an enduring blueprint for preventing similar lapses in the future. Culturally, the case left a mark that extended beyond law and policy. It haunted discussions in media, literature, and public discourse. Documentaries, articles, and analyses explored the lives of the victims, the methods of the killer, and the systemic failures that allowed him to operate for so long. Society grappled with the uncomfortable duality of horror and normalization, how one man could live among neighbors, attend local events, and appear ordinary while committing atrocities in the shadows. This tension, between the familiar and the monstrous, became a touchstone for conversations about human behavior, community vigilance, and empathy for those most at risk. Yet, perhaps the most enduring aspect of the aftermath is intangible. It resides in memory, in acknowledgement, in the act of refusing to forget. Every story told about the victims, every photograph displayed, every name spoken aloud serves as a counterpoint to the anonymity that Picton attempted to impose. Communities created memorials, advocacy groups formed, and survivors' voices were amplified to ensure that the lessons of neglect and oversight would not fade. These acts are forms of resilience, ways to reclaim agency and dignity in the face of overwhelming violation, a testament to the human capacity to endure, remember, and insist that lives, no matter how marginalized, matter. And finally, there is the slow, ongoing confrontation with the concept of evil itself. People struggle to comprehend how a single individual could methodically harm so many over such a prolonged period. Questions arise endlessly: how could neighbors not notice? How could the system fail so consistently? How do we reconcile ordinary interactions with unspeakable acts? The answers are rarely simple. They exist in a combination of psychological profiling, sociological context, systemic critique, and moral reflection. Confronting these questions is uncomfortable, but it is necessary. It is part of the collective process of understanding, of ensuring vigilance, and of honoring the lives that were lost. The story of the Picton case does not end with the trial or the sentence. Its echoes persist in policies, in public consciousness, and in the hearts of families and communities forever altered. It is a narrative that blends horror with the responsibility of memory, a reminder that justice, while essential, is only one part of a larger, ongoing reckoning. And in that reckoning, the silence of the victims is transformed into testimony, not through their presence, but through the persistence of those who refuse to let their lives, their existence, and their suffering be forgotten. In the aftermath, the world continues to turn, streets remain busy, lights continue to glow over familiar corners, yet beneath the surface, the lessons remain. Awareness, vigilance, empathy, and accountability are forged in the crucible of tragedy. The Picton case stands as a somber, unyielding symbol of what occurs when society overlooks the vulnerable and of how the pursuit of justice, though delayed, is a moral imperative that must be pursued relentlessly. It is both a cautionary tale and a call to conscience, a reminder that even in the darkest chapters, acknowledgement and action are possible, and that memory itself can serve as a form of protection, ensuring that horror is neither ignored nor repeated. The story of Robert Picton did not end with the gavel, the life sentence, or the courtroom emptying. Its effects stretched far beyond the prison walls, far beyond the farm outside Vancouver, into the lives of those who had been tangentially touched by the darkness, and into the very institutions that had once failed to notice. The downtown East Side, already a community marked by poverty, addiction, and marginalization, carried the scars of these events. Streets where women had walked safely, or at least without lethal suspicion, now seemed haunted. Every alley, every familiar corner, became a place of caution, a reminder that the ordinary could mask the unimaginable. For residents, even those who had not known the victims personally, the presence of that horror created a pervasive sense of vulnerability, a subtle tension that lingered like a shadow on the periphery of daily life. Community organizations sprang into action, some in grief, others in righteous urgency. Shelters, advocacy groups, and local support networks worked to strengthen their response to women at risk, to ensure that the vulnerabilities that Picton had exploited would not be overlooked again. Programs focusing on addiction recovery, outreach, and protection for sex workers grew more robust. Streets that had once seemed invisible to the rest of the city began to be noticed, mapped, and patrolled not with judgment, but with care. In this way, tragedy produced vigilance, horror forced attention to the overlooked. The ripple effect extended into families forever changed. Parents, siblings, children, and friends who had endured years of uncertainty confronted the reality of their loved ones' fates, then sought ways to honor them. Memorials were established, ceremonies held, names spoken aloud so that they would not dissolve into silence. Each act of remembrance carried weight, a defiance against the erasure of the lives lost. At the same time, grief remained uneven, unquantifiable. Some could face the world with a brittle form of closure, others were trapped in cycles of sorrow, haunted by the knowledge of what might have been had authorities acted sooner. Legal institutions, too, were forced to reckon. The Picton case exposed procedural lapses, communication failures, and gaps in the handling of missing persons reports. Reviews of law enforcement practices revealed a pattern: marginalized women were too often assumed to be transient, unreliable witnesses to their own disappearances, or engaged in lifestyles that lessened the urgency of their cases. The Canadian justice system responded with reforms aimed at preventing repetition. Databases for missing persons were upgraded, interagency communication was prioritized, and protocols for investigating vulnerable populations were revised. Police training began to include explicit modules on recognizing patterns in disappearances, understanding trauma, and engaging with communities in ways that built trust rather than suspicion. These changes were slow to take root but marked a fundamental shift in approach, a structural acknowledgement of past oversight. Culturally, the case forced the nation to confront the uncomfortable proximity of evil. Picton had lived among neighbors, maintained a seemingly ordinary presence, yet had orchestrated atrocities over many years. The tension between normalcy and horror captivated public consciousness, seeping into books, documentaries, media discussions, and academic research. His farm became a symbol of hidden menace, a physical representation of how isolation, neglect, and systemic indifference can allow cruelty to persist unseen. People struggled with the cognitive dissonance: a man who bought groceries, socialized casually, and maintained a facade of normal life could also commit unthinkable crimes. That paradox became a touchstone in understanding human behavior, highlighting the complex interplay between appearance, context, and intent. Psychologically, survivors, witnesses, and residents of the affected neighborhoods experienced lingering trauma. Those who had interacted with Picton or his environment carried invisible scars, heightened anxiety, mistrust, and hypervigilance in spaces once familiar. Trauma counseling and mental health services became vital lifelines, attempting to repair what could not be undone, helping people navigate the world after prolonged exposure to fear, ambiguity, and grief. These efforts were imperfect but essential, because the emotional fallout of mass trauma cannot be legislated, it must be nurtured, understood, and witnessed. For the broader society, the case became a lens for reflection. Questions emerged about moral responsibility, social negligence, and community oversight. How could so many disappearances go unnoticed, or at least unconnected, for years? How could systems designed to protect fail repeatedly? These questions were uncomfortable, but they spurred conversation, policy, and advocacy. People began to examine not just criminality, but societal blind spots, challenging assumptions about whose safety mattered and why. Awareness campaigns, education, and media coverage sought to reframe the narrative. Victims were not statistics, they were individuals deserving attention, protection, and remembrance. In universities and law enforcement training programs, Picton's case became a cautionary study. Not just for its sheer horror, but for its lessons in pattern recognition, the importance of early intervention, and the ethical responsibilities of institutions. The case was dissected in seminars, simulations, and investigative exercises, providing critical insight into the ways human systems can fail and how those failures can be prevented. And yet, despite these structural, cultural, and educational ripples, there remained a persistent, haunting truth. The lives lost could not be restored. The pain of absence could not be legislated away. Even as communities rebuilt vigilance, as policies changed, and as memorials preserved memory, the void remained. It was a quiet, unyielding presence, a reminder that awareness, reform, and justice, while essential, cannot replace what has been destroyed. Ultimately, the Picton case serves as both warning and guide. It reminds us that evil often hides in plain sight, that systems and communities must remain attentive, and that memory is a form of justice in itself. Through remembrance, reform, and reflection, the shadow of the past can inform the present, shaping a society more vigilant, more compassionate, and more aware of the costs of neglect. The horror of the crimes persists, but so does the resolve to ensure that silence, oversight, and vulnerability are no longer tolerated. The story, though rooted in tragedy, continues to shape the moral and social landscape, demanding vigilance, empathy, and action in a world where darkness can sometimes seem ordinary. Even years after the trial concluded and Robert Picton was sentenced to life in prison, the shadow of his crimes continued to stretch over communities, institutions, and consciousness alike. The story of Picton is not contained within a single courtroom or a single farm. It lives in the policies that were rewritten, the streets that were cautiously walked, the memories of families, and the persistent questions about society's failures. The downtown east side of Vancouver, long a hub of marginalized populations, became both a symbol of vulnerability and a space of resilience. People learned, often painfully, that invisibility could carry deadly consequences. Women who had been dismissed as transient or marginalized were no longer just statistics, they became a central lens through which the broader system of law enforcement, social services, and public awareness was scrutinized. In the legal world, Picton's case catalyzed structural reform. Police procedures for missing persons were overhauled. Law enforcement officers were trained to recognize patterns, to link disappearances more quickly, and to understand the systemic biases that had previously led to neglect. Protocols were introduced to ensure cross-departmental communication, creating an environment where cases could not be siloed or dismissed due to a victim's socio-economic status. Investigators learned that the voices of those on the margins, the sex workers, the addicts, the homeless, must be heard, taken seriously, and protected, because ignoring them could have catastrophic consequences. Courts, prosecutors, and defense teams alike examined the importance of handling massive evidence sets with meticulous care, of presenting narratives in ways that are both legally sound and emotionally resonant. Picton became a case study in procedural diligence, but also a cautionary tale of what happens when institutional oversight fails repeatedly over years. Culturally, the Picton case forced Canadians to confront a truth they were reluctant to face: horror can exist in plain sight. Picton had been a neighbor, a familiar face, a farmer who hosted parties and appeared ordinary. The cognitive dissonance of someone so integrated into the community committing unthinkable crimes sparked national reflection. Writers, filmmakers, and journalists explored the paradox between everyday normalcy and latent evil, the idea that danger can hide behind the mundane, waiting for the right circumstances. The media coverage, documentaries, and books surrounding the case did not just retell events, they interrogated the social fabric that allowed these crimes to continue unnoticed. Through these narratives, the story of the victims became central, reclaiming their identities from the shadows and emphasizing that societal indifference had contributed to the tragedy. For families, the legacy was intimate and painful. Even after convictions, grief persisted. The knowledge that other victims likely remained unidentified left open wounds. Memorials and commemorations were established, offering symbolic recognition and a chance for community acknowledgement. Advocacy groups formed, pushing for broader systemic reform and outreach programs aimed at vulnerable populations. Each act of remembrance was an assertion that these lives mattered, that they were not lost to the anonymity of crime statistics, that they were visible, remembered, and mourned. In this, families found both solace and renewed purpose, ensuring the victims' experiences would inform public consciousness and future protective measures. Psychologically, the long shadow of Picton's crimes extended into the community. Survivors, witnesses, and even casual observers experienced lingering trauma. The fear of being ignored or dismissed became interwoven with daily life. Community support networks became crucial, offering counseling and creating safe spaces where people could process grief, fear, and anger. The lessons were personal as well as structural. Vigilance, self-protection, and awareness became survival mechanisms, particularly for women navigating spaces that had once been fraught with danger. Even those indirectly affected carried the weight of what had occurred, a reminder that evil can ripple outward in ways beyond direct interaction. Educationally, the Picton case reshaped training for law enforcement, social work, and forensic investigation. Students analyzed the failures and successes of the case, understanding the consequences of delayed action, overlooked evidence, and societal biases. Courses in criminology dissected Picton's methods, the psychological profiling that eventually aided his capture, and the strategies used to recover evidence from a highly compromised crime scene. It became a blueprint for understanding serial predation, systemic neglect, and the interplay between marginalized populations and institutional responsibility. Lessons emphasized that understanding patterns of risk and recognizing signals, no matter how subtle, can prevent future tragedies.